All right, let's jump right into this explainer and really meticulously map out the thousand-year trajectory of ancient Rome. We're going to look incredibly closely at its unstoppable rise to power, and then, of course, its ultimate multi-causal collapse. Because look, this isn't just a simple story of one sudden military defeat, right? It's a fascinating historical analysis of how complex systems are built, how they function, and how deeply embedded structural flaws can eventually just tear them apart from the inside out. So let's kick things off with a pretty massive, provocative question. Did the rise of the Christian faith actually cause the fall of the Western Roman Empire? If you look back to the 18th century, the incredibly famous historian Edward Gibbon published a monumental piece of work claiming exactly that. He basically argued that Christianity sapped Rome's martial vigor, diverted all this money and resources to the church, and undermined the traditional imperial cults that literally held the state together. Honestly, it's a very elegant, famous theory. But the short answer? Absolutely not. Modern scholars completely and universally reject Gibbon's thesis. As we analyze the actual historical and archaeological data throughout this explainer, we're going to uncover the real, documented reasons behind Rome's unraveling. As you'll see, the severe political instability and the crushing economic decline that brought Rome to its knees, yeah, those were well underway long before Christianity ever became the dominant religion. Okay. Here's our roadmap for this historical analysis. We're covering 1. The engine of expansion. 2. The Republic's fatal flaw. 3. Augustus and Pax Romana. 4. The 3rd century crisis. And finally, 5. Why did Rome fall? Let's start with part 1. The engine of expansion. The Republic's military-agricultural complex. We're going back to the early days of the Roman Republic to look at its truly formidable engine of conquest. The actual composition of the early Roman military is so fascinating. Rome didn't rely on mercenaries early on. No, their legions were strictly composed of propertied citizens, mostly just everyday farmers. But as Rome defeated Carthage around 146 BC and rapidly expanded its territory across the Mediterranean, war completely changed. Wars were no longer these quick, seasonal, local affairs. They became prolonged, vastly distant military campaigns. Imagine being a citizen soldier deployed for years at a time. It made it literally impossible to maintain your farm back home. So this military-agricultural complex definitely fueled an informal cosmopolitan empire, but it was actively destroying the livelihood of the exact citizens who were fighting for it. And that massive recruitment crisis leads us right into part 2, the Republic's fatal flaw. Solving a crisis, creating a dictatorship. Let's look at how one military reform accidentally destroyed the entire republic. So because so many of these propertied citizens had lost their land due to those painfully long deployments, Rome was rapidly running out of eligible soldiers to fight off invading tribes. They were in a panic. So in 104 BC, the general Gaius Marius institutes this incredibly radical reform. He just starts recruiting the Capiticensi, which basically translates to the head count or the landless poor of Rome, directly into the professional legions. He completely removed the old property requirement and the state provided standardized training and equipment instead. Now, this right here brilliantly illustrates the Republic's fatal flaw. Think about the stark difference. The pre-Marian army consisted of guys who actually had farms to return to, right? Their loyalty was fundamentally tied to the Roman state itself. But that post-Marian army, it was made up of the desperately poor. Because the state didn't provide a structured pension, these new soldiers relied entirely on their commanding generals to secure them land and wealth when they retired. It's a massive shift. Military loyalty fatally shifted away from the Senate directly into the hands of ambitious generals. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that by giving soldiers a strict financial reason to be loyal only to their commanders, Marius inadvertently laid the groundwork for warlords. Generals like Sulla and later, of course, Julius Caesar realized they suddenly commanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They literally turned their, what were essentially private armies, against Rome itself, marching on the city and plunging the Republic into decades of bloody, exhausting civil war, all just to achieve their own political ambitions. Completely exhausted by all this civil war, Rome transitions to part 3, Augustus and Pax Romana, the illusion of permanence. To stop that endless cycle of civil wars, Julius Caesar's heir, Augustus, steps up and fundamentally changes the game. He centralizes all military command directly under himself. No more rival generals, period. He slashes the bloated army size from over 60 legions down to a much more manageable 28. But most importantly, he instituted a fixed, standardized daily pay and retirement land for soldiers directly from the state treasury. This permanently cut that dangerous bond between soldiers and independent generals. He also cleverly treated the newly conquered immensely wealthy Egypt basically as his own personal domain, using its riches to fund a massive bureaucracy and huge road-building projects. The result of these sweeping structural reforms was the famous Pax Romana, or Roman peace. But here's the thing. Peace wasn't just an absence of war. It was a deliberate, massive economic catalyst. Safe transportation across the Mediterranean and thousands of miles of newly built roads completely integrated previously underdeveloped Western provinces into a booming, globalized market. Roman citizens and artisans emigrated all over the place, settling in new colonies and expanding trade in a way the ancient world had quite literally never seen before. It was a golden age. But, as you might guess, this socioeconomic miracle didn't last forever. That illusion of permanence violently shatters in Part 4, the 3rd century crisis, spanning from 235 to 284 AD. Just wrap your head around this number. In a devastating 50-year span, the Roman state churned through more than 25 emperors. 25. And almost every single one of these men died violently at the hands of their own troops or bitter rivals. The empire was quite literally tearing itself apart from the inside. So how did this incredibly strong structure fail so spectacularly? Well, first off, Rome never actually established a clear constitutional system for monarchical succession. When a crisis hit, whoever had the biggest army simply took the throne by force. And the external crises at this time, they were terrifyingly real. You had massive new invasions from the Sassanid Persians in the east, led by King Shapur I, and huge Gothic confederations in the north. The Roman soldiers felt the central elites in Rome were just too incompetent to protect the borders, so they repeatedly usurped power to install their own local military commanders. Add in a truly devastating demographic hit from a pandemic known as the Plague of Cyprian, plus rampant hyperinflation driven by the need to constantly pay these warring armies, and the empire literally fractured into 3 competing, hostile states. Now, amazingly, Rome didn't completely fall here. The incredibly tough core Danubian army somehow managed to hold the center together through the absolute darkest years of pestilence and invasion. Eventually, Emperor Diocletian comes along and manages to reunite and completely transform the state in 284 AD. But honestly, the structural damage was permanent. The drastically weakened tax base, the new heavy reliance on military strongmen, the permanently exposed frontiers, it was all baked in now, leading us directly to the final collapse. Which brings us to our final part, Part 5. Why did Rome fall? The multi-causal collapse of the West. If it wasn't Christianity, what actually brought down the Western Empire in the 5th century? Let's trace this tragic domino effect. Driven westward by the terrifying rapid expansion of the Huns, huge migrating Germanic confederations pushed forcefully into Roman territory. In 378 AD, they absolutely devastated the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, even killing the emperor on the battlefield. By 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, achieved the unthinkable. They actually sacked the city of Rome itself. But perhaps the most fatal structural blow happened a bit later, in 439, when the Vandals captured Carthage in North Africa. That completely cut off the Western Empire's main grain supply and its richest, most vital source of tax revenue. Starved of funds and food, the state just withered away until 476 AD, when the Germanic general Odoacer quietly deposed the last Western emperor. Now, as we've seen, there isn't just one simple answer to this collapse. If you ask modern historians, they point to a really deadly combination of factors. Peter Heather, for instance, emphasizes the massive external shock of the Huns and those barbarian invasions. Adrian Goldsworthy points straight to the internal rot of endless civil wars, stretching all the way back to the Republic. Kyle Harper brings in fascinating modern scientific data, showing a late antique Little Ice Age and devastating pandemic diseases that just ruined agriculture. And Brian Ward Perkins, he highlights a vicious economic cycle. Invasions destroy your tax base, meaning you can't pay the army, which inevitably just leads to more invasions. And getting back to where we started, here is the ultimate historical proof against Edward Gibbon's religious theory from the beginning of this explainer. The Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, was actually far more heavily Christianized than the West. Yet it successfully navigated these exact same crises. The economic shifts, the plagues, the invasions, they survived it all and kept going for another 1,000 years, all the way until 1453 AD. So the collapse in the West? It was a failure of geography, politics, and military economics, not a change in religion. Ultimately, we study this monumental collapse because, as historian Glenn Bowersick so beautifully notes, Rome serves as a mirror for our own societal anxieties. We look at its ancient ruins and we can't help but see the inherent vulnerabilities of all human institutions, no matter how invincible they might seem at their absolute peak. So I want to leave you with this final thought. As you look at the modern world through the analytical lens of everything we've just unpacked today, what lessons should we be taking away from the complex structural unraveling of the ancient world's greatest superpower? Seriously, think about how things like climate shifts, border pressures, and intense internal political division deeply echo in our own world today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.